of the Ferguson Library. And I just wanted to welcome everyone tonight. I would be very remiss if I didn't tell you that tomorrow is Fairfield County Community Foundation's Giving Day, and it's your opportunity to give to the Ferguson Library. Small gifts are welcome, big gifts are even more welcome, but all are appreciated, and it helps us to bring to you programs like this as well as books, which is our bread and butter. We rely heavily on the Friends of the Ferguson Library. They are our secret sauce, and I know some of you have heard me say that before, but really without the Friends of the Ferguson Library, we wouldn't be able to do so many things. In particular, our Books for Babies program that has been in existence since the 1980s, where every child born in Stanford receives a book. Our wonderful used bookshop, where you're able to get fantastic books at a reasonable price, as well as our literary competition. And if you haven't been to that award ceremony, hoping to do it in person this year, you're missing a major event. It's for kids, students, children in grades 3 through 12. All of this they do with hard labor, volunteer labor, lots of loves, many laughs. And so I invite you to join the Friends of the Ferguson Library. We also have a special partnership with Elm Street Books. And if you are interested in the books that you're hearing about tonight, and I don't know why you wouldn't be, you can purchase them at Elm Street Books. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Mary Thies, who is part of the committee, co-chair of the committee that brings us these wonderful author programs. Mary?
Thank you, Alice. We welcome you to this special event with Erica Katz and Alafair Burke. We will be having an opportunity to hear from them about their work. And if you have questions, we encourage you to use the chat box for that, and we will try and incorporate your questions into our discussion tonight. So Erica and Alafair, we're so glad to have you tonight.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
So let's get started. Both of you have a background in the law, and I'm curious about the influence that your knowledge and practice of the law had on your writing of your two books. Erica, would you like to start?
Sure. So I don't know that my legal background helped me tremendously in writing this, because thankfully I never had any run-ins with the FBI as a corporate lawyer. If I had, I would have been doing something horrifically wrong. But I think my legal background informs my writing in a very sort of esoteric manner, in that, and I think Alafair might agree, being a good lawyer is a lot of viewing all the angles of a given situation honestly and anticipating next steps. And I think as a writer of fiction, I'm constantly placing myself in a character's shoes and anticipating what they would realistically do in a situation, much as I did when I was doing deals as a lawyer. And I think being a lawyer, you don't shy away from daunting amounts of work and paperwork. And that is a lot of what writing a book is. It's a lot of drafting and editing and reaching page 400 and realizing you have 100 to go, but you're going to cut it down to 300. And I think that really helped me in writing books.
Great. Thank you. Alafair.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Erica and I practice very different kinds of law. She's a corporate lawyer, and I'm a former prosecutor and practice criminal law, but I do think that what she was saying is true, that lawyers generally have to learn how to organize massive amounts of material and give it a structure, and just juggle a lot of information. And so when you're dealing with something as big as a full-size manuscript, that helps. But particularly trying cases at the DA's office, if you think about it, just even if you've watched Law and Order, trials are not telling a story in a linear fashion, right? Normally you tell a story kind of beginning, middle, and end. And a trial forces you to break evidence down, and you have to present it in a sort of artificial way, witness by witness by witness. And it kind of forces you to think about, okay, I know this piece of evidence, what witness is going to tell the jury that? And writing a novel, especially if you're writing a third person novel, which is what I usually write, you're making choices about point of view and what character learns what in which order, and who tells the reader what and when. So I think just in terms of plotting and structure, that experience helps. Specific to me, being a prosecutor, I never actually thought I'd be a novelist. I was just a big reader, and my dad's a writer, which probably of course, I didn't want to do it if my dad did it. So I just wanted to try cases and be a prosecutor and someday be a law professor, which is what I am now. But I did get an idea for a book, kind of it was a mashup between two real life cases I worked on. And as you do, you fictionalize it, right? You think, well, what if this and what if that? And before I knew it, I was yet another lawyer who kind of had a dream, like someday I'll write a book. And, so the subject matter of my work definitely led to that first novel. And since then, some of the cases, some of the books that I've written have been based on real cases, others not. But that first one definitely was.
Thank you. Well, one more question for the two of you, then I'll talk to each of you individually. Both of your books dealt in some way with memory. In Find Me, the character suffers from total memory loss after a devastating accident. And in the subplot of Fake, the main character's childhood memories may have become distorted over time. Certainly they have greatly influenced her. What was it like writing about memory loss or the unreliability of memory? Alafair, do you want to start?
Sure. I've always been fascinated by memory. I studied it as my undergraduate major, and as a law professor, I write about wrongful convictions, where one of the big sources of wrongful convictions is mistaken eyewitness testimony. And so we're just learning that memory is a lot more fragile and malleable than I think people knew, even 20 years ago. And I think we all know that feeling of you'll be telling a story and then you realize, do I really remember that correctly? Did that actually happen to me, or am I telling someone else's story? Or wait a second, who was you'll swear that, so-and-so was there. And then that person will say, no, I wasn't there. And then a friend will correct you and say, that wasn't Ernie, it was Bert, and your memory is Bert. It was, the other one. And I think we all know that feeling of thinking you know something and then something happens to make you second guess it. And I think that that's a really just kind of a powerful ground for fiction, especially crime fiction, where it's not even that, everybody's kind of used to a traditional detective story or something where the detectives aren't sure who's telling the truth and who's lying. And at the end, they figure it out, but I think when even the people involved in it start to replay their memories and second guess what they think they know, then that's when things get really interesting because even they're not sure what's real.
Yeah. Oh, great. Thank you. Erica.
I completely agree. And my narrator, it's a first person book. My narrator is somewhat unreliable and her memory is distorted. So like Alafair was saying, that is where I become hyper interested in what a character does and why she does it, especially if she's operating under false pretenses that she doesn't even know are false. I find it all super interesting. And just so I don't regurgitate what Alafair said, probably far less articulately, I might as well just take it a step further and say the actions and reactions that we take, I think, are necessarily informed by memory, and the fragility of that memory is so informative and dictates what we do in our present day. And the fact that it's fragile is so fascinating, because what if we do exactly what Alafair says and misremember, right? Rather than, in my book explores, rather than simply uncovering the truth of the past, operating in the present under false pretenses, which is really interesting. And I think that it's not unbelievably dramatic, but it affects her present day psyche so greatly, this like lack of a certain memory that she's blocked out or repressed. And I think to some extent in writing it, I was sort of wondering if I do that and who around me does that. People have interesting and remarkable emotional reactions to things all the time. And I really became quite interested while I was in the real depths of writing Fake, how much of that comes from stories we've told ourselves, or as Alafair was saying, mistold ourselves over the years. And so it makes for wonderful literature to not know what the truth is. And rather than tell a story from a confusing point of view, you can just have the character herself or himself be confused or be misremembering. And that leads to really interesting decision-making and drama. So that is why I chose to have my character repress her past.
It also makes for very interesting reading. So I thank you for both of you for that. Erica, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit more about your book, the premise. I mean, don't give away anything, but summarize the premise of your book and where did the idea come from?
The book came out yesterday, so no spoilers, and also not insulted if you haven't read it yet, because it would mean you are quite a speed reader. The book follows our protagonist, Emma Kahn, who has given up on her own dreams of being an artist and now has the occupation of legitimately copying high-end artwork for legitimate buyers, whether they be putting their art in a museum for a tax break or a bank for insurance purposes. She provides very legitimate copies, and she finds herself unwittingly involved in a forgery scheme, as a shock to no one probably at this point in my little spiel. And it is about how she extricates herself from that very dangerous, very glamorous situation, and in doing so needs to confront her own past and how she is fake in her own life. So, and the idea for the book actually came out of my own increased use of social media to promote my first book, which I was told that I needed to do. I needed to have a social media presence. And I really, it's somewhat of a lofty intellectual theme, but I really did struggle with the self I was presenting to the world and the self I was living every day. And as I was a greater consumer of social media as well, in needing to promote my books, I just started to think about how fake that entire world is. All the while, there are always tons of art forgery schemes and fraud schemes happening in the world. Just yesterday, the New York Times broke a story about a bunch of Basquiat's, who is a great artist. I think there were like 12 of them found in someone's basement. That reeks of fraud, in my opinion. So, there are stories all over about fake art, and it is a fascinating, sexy, high-octane world where billions of dollars are being spent in an unregulated market. And I thought it was such a beautiful parallel to talk about what was fake in my protagonist's life, to have her be an artist and to have her confront that fakeness as well.
Yeah, it was fascinating to me. How did you get interested in the visual arts? I mean, was that something that came before or in the midst of this? Or?
So I have a few friends, 2 friends, so just a couple friends who are really live and breathe the art world. They're art consultants who have gone off on their own, and they're incredibly knowledgeable. And when I've traveled with them to museums or art fairs, I am so daunted by how little I know that it was also an exercise in educating myself. I read a ton. I did all the research, asked all the questions I could. And unfortunately, my in-person experience of art fairs and museums was hindered because of COVID. But I really feel that I tried my best to immerse myself in this world, and I had a ton of fun doing it. So I think I've always been fascinated with art. In general, though, I'm more fascinated with any objective dictation of subjective taste. So I've always found it interesting. I'm not a wine person, but I've always found it interesting that a wine I like, someone can stick their nose up at simply because the market dictates it's worth $500, where I like a $12 bottle of wine. Who's to say that the best Bordeaux in the world is better than Coca-Cola if you like Coca-Cola? So anyway, I'm fascinated with taste and market manipulation of really highly valued items. And so that is also why the art world appeals to me.
Some of the comments in your book about that you put words in the mouth of your characters about their philosophy of art, and also their understanding and appreciation or lack of appreciation for things like the work of galleries or the work of auctions, or which was this new thing, the non-fungible tokens thing.
Yes.
That was
I had to throw that in. It's all over the news.
Yeah. So where do you come down? Were any of them speaking your philosophy, or are these philosophies that you had picked up in your research? Go ahead.
So I think that every character I write is probably at least 15% me, right? Because I'm writing them. So there are thoughts that I've had and things that I've, experienced. Again, many of the criticisms of the art world were not mine. Many of the criticisms of the art world were mine. I think that the more I learned about price setting and how auctions, it's basically treated like the art is treated like a commodity, and you can trade against it. You can actually make money if a piece of art undersells. Like, it is a big financial game with no regulation. And I don't actually care too much. I mean, you sort of need to be a billionaire or a very successful millionaire to play in this world. And so I sort of understand play at your own risk. However, that doesn't mean that I don't struggle as someone who tries to write myself with the notion that perhaps not all cream, meaning not all amazing artists, actually get noticed and rise to the top. And that is what really interests me, is when I feel that the system is slightly rigged, and I wanted to talk about it. It's very rigged, and I wanted to talk about it, but that doesn't mean that the art out there, the actual art that is successful, is not brilliant. It just means that I really wonder, and no one will ever know for sure, I suppose, whether there are brilliant artists out there like my protagonist who never get discovered because the system is rigged.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Can we follow up a little bit on your, you were talking about having to do social media on your behalf, your own behalf, and your protagonist becomes a social media influencer. I confess I don't do Facebook, so.
Lucky you.
And she's very busy on Instagram, and once she begins to get a following, she's constantly checking, looking at the numbers, putting out, more postings so that people will follow her, even asking people's opinion about her clothes, what clothes should she buy? So can you tell us a little bit more about your experience of social media? Do you have people telling you what clothes to buy?
No. If we're being completely honest, I wish I had a big enough following that people cared what I wore. But it wasn't so much my experience with social media as it was a function of the pandemic, probably. I think I wondered a lot more about the generation, probably a few generations behind me, how it would affect their lives going forward, given that their whole social network was necessarily on social media for the past 2 years. I think that is, I was so critical of the world because of that, probably. And it was extremely liberating to write COVID out of existence. In my book, which I did, it didn't exist. People were in bars, people were traveling, and that was amazingly therapeutic for me. But something that has really been on my mind during this pandemic is the social recovery of people who grew up with, so not necessarily myself, but who grew up with social media. And so we're already reliant on it. And then it became not only acceptable, but encouraged to rely on it because it was people's only window into the world. And so I think that the pandemic actually really informed my part of writing that part of the book. And I learned a ton about how people fake things on Instagram. And I also hope you agree that I'm not overly critical of it. And I definitely see the utility of it. In fact, part of my protagonist's success in the end is based on her following. And so I don't think that, I don't have any judgment about it. I just hope that people are also okay when they're not using it, right? And the sad part to me was that she became obsessed, not that she used it.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Alafair, tell us a little bit about your book, please.
My book is called Find Me. I think of it as having two main characters. One you meet very quickly. I don't think it's a spoiler alert because it says right on the cover that she's about to go missing, but her name is Hope Miller. And she has been living for the last 15 years in a small town in New Jersey where she's very comfortable and everyone knows her and kind of looks after her. And she decides at the 15-year mark that she wants to be more independent, and she moves to East Hampton, New York, to try to, live somewhere on her own without so much assistance. And she goes missing after she's been there for 2 weeks. The other main character is her best friend, Lindsay Kelly, who knows her from that small town in New Jersey, but lives in New York. And she's really worried about whether her friend can do this on her own. And when she goes missing, she is feeling very guilty that she didn't stop it from happening. And she becomes kind of determined to find her. What makes their friendship unusual? I mean, I think their friendship will look very familiar, particularly people who have close female friends, like they call each other found family. They are, very tight and, kind of unconditional love and support for each other. What makes that friendship unusual is its foundation. So the way they met is 15 years earlier. Lindsay was on her way back from graduating from college in New York City, back to that small town that she's from in New Jersey. And she found a SUV overturned at the side of the road in the middle of a big rainstorm. And when she got out to check to see what was going on, she found a young woman thrown from the SUV and thought she was dead. She called an ambulance, and that was Hope. When Hope woke up at the hospital, she luckily lived. She survived her physical injuries, but she had no idea what her name was. She claimed not to know where she was from, how she got to this town in New Jersey where nobody recognized her, or why she was in a car with out-of-state plates that turned out to be stolen, and why she had no ID and no cash. And so kind of that big mystery of who she was, in the UK, the name of the book is actually The Girl She Was, because she doesn't really know, right? But at some point she just kind of left it behind. I mean, all of this is her backstory. So she doesn't have amnesia currently, except for the first, 20 years of her life or so. For 15 years, she's been living as a new person with an assumed name. At some point, she just had to move on with her life. But she realizes 15 years in that she's kind of been stagnating, that she's almost been living in limbo, this kind of infantilized life where everybody still feels sorry for her. Everybody feels like she needs to be taken care of. Everyone still treats her as that poor girl with amnesia. And, and a few people kind of wonder if she was even telling the truth, right? So, but she's always that girl. And so that's why she moves to East Hampton, is she wants anonymity. She doesn't want to be seen as that poor little girl anymore. But when she goes missing, it raises questions about whether the past has caught up with her. And as Lindsay searches for her best friend, she has to wonder if she's starting to dig up things that perhaps were meant to stay in the past. We were talking about fascination with memory. I think as somebody this is my 14th crime novel, I think. A lot of novels, a lot of crime novels, right? People are trying to kind of shut the door on the past, right? You've got characters who have turned their lives around and living the perfect life with their great husband and kids, and something from the past comes into the present and pulls them back into some situation. What I liked about the idea of her having not current amnesia, but amnesia from 15 years ago, right, is she literally had a literal door to her memories of the past. It wasn't a choice to move forward into a new life. She was kind of forced to do that. And to echo back on what we were all talking about with respect to memory and how important it is to identity, is even when 15 years goes by, right, with each day, you're kind of getting to know yourself better, I suppose. But if you don't really know who you were, in the formative years of your life. She doesn't even know her age. They kind of guess she's probably around 20 years old. Like she knew how to like make mixed drinks. So they decided she might be 21, or she might have just been a teenager who drank a lot. So she doesn't know, right? She doesn't know if she was a good person or a bad person. She doesn't know if she's a victim or a perpetrator. She doesn't know if she was privileged or not. She knows that no one's looking for her though, right? When she gets in this car accident, it's not like someone's calling around trying to find her. And there's other indications, like she's in a stolen car alone with no cash and no ID, that maybe whatever was in her past wasn't so great. So she kind of makes the choice to just go forward with, what was her future, 15 years ago, but now she's kind of living with those consequences and not really able to move forward. And then she goes missing. So, and then more things happen, but I won't say what.
Well, if it's safe to say this, can you talk a little bit about the challenge that she faces because she doesn't have a firm identity? She has this acquired identity.
One of the most difficult challenges for me in terms of wanting readers, because you've got to care about the person who's missing, right? Otherwise, it's just a book about some missing thing that you never got to meet. So it's not a spoiler to tell you that you meet Hope in the opening pages of the book, and hopefully you care about her. But you also learn why it's more difficult for her to start over again in a new place, and also why it's more difficult to find her when she goes missing. And it's always the case when you write a book, the things that people find most unbelievable are the things that are actually true. So it is actually true that if you don't know who you are, but are alive, you can't just start a new identity. And if you think about the reasons for that, right, there's not going to be, it's not very common that someone just doesn't know who they are, right? Like even full cases of retrograde amnesia tend to be temporary, right? It'll go away in weeks or months after the traumatic event has passed, or after the physical injuries, if that's the cause of it, have abated. So you don't have a ton of people out there wandering around not knowing who they are. You've got a lot mentally ill people wandering around the streets, for example. Some of them may be so broken from reality that they can't tell you their names. It's like babies abandoned, right? You might not know who they are. And then these few cases, and there's not a lot of them, but they are real, these few cases of people who have had retrograde amnesia for years. So the number of people who actually need to just set up an identity from scratch without telling, it's one thing, if I want to change my name, I can change my name to Mary or Erica or whatever I want to change it to, but I would have to tell, the government, my name used to be Kanye and now I'm going to go by Ye. And if I want to do that, I can, but Kanye is now Ye, Prince became a symbol, right? Who Alafair changed her name to Mary, but to just start an identity from scratch, very few people need it. And then Erica could probably write a book about it. The potential for fraud is so obvious and tremendous. You can't just let people have multiple social security numbers and multiple driver's licenses. So she doesn't have a social security number. She doesn't have an ID. She doesn't have insurance that's actually hers. She doesn't exist. She's kind of living in limbo. And so that makes it harder for her to live her life, but it also makes it a lot harder to find her when she goes missing. So, hopefully if I go missing, someone will look for me. And one thing you would do, right, is put a freeze on my credit cards, I'll be on the lookout on my license plate, right? Do all the things to look for, you would track my numbers, right? We all have stuff in the system that can be tracked, but she's not that person. So the car that she drives legally belongs to Lindsay. So Lindsay's choice is she can report her car stolen, but that's not the same as saying my friend is missing and help me find my friend. Instead, if she gets stopped, it will be from the perspective that she's a suspect in a stolen car, and then she won't have a driver's license. And then her explanation for all of that will sound really weird to a stranger. I have amnesia. And so Lindsay's hands are kind of strapped and she has to get a little bit more creative about how she goes and finds her.
Wow. Yeah. It was fascinating. I didn't know that before I read the book. So that was very interesting. Thank you for sharing that. There's a third female character in your book. which you bring in, who's an ongoing character in another series. This is not part of the series, as I understand it. This
Yeah,
is
that's right.
standalone.
Very confusing. It's not confusing to read, to explain. My recurring character, so I have a series with 5 books in it that feature NYPD homicide detective Ellie Hatcher. And she is in this book. But when I said to me, there's 2 main characters, to me, she's kind of the third. She's the third character. But she's not working the case. She kind of gets pulled in for personal reasons, and we'll just leave it at that. But she winds up kind of having a somewhat skeptical alliance with Lindsay in terms of being willing to help her look for hope, even though she's not convinced hope is on the up and up, but she has her own personal reasons for trying to figure out where she went and who she used to be. So for people who read the Ellie Hatcher series, when you get there, you'll be like, hey, I know you. And if you've never read the Ellie Hatcher series, it'll still make sense.
It certainly does. So would you care to talk about your experience growing up in Wichita and the community angst, fear about the serial killer that was at work, I guess is the term is.
So
when you were
I
growing
thought I was interested in crime, right? That I was a lawyer who was interested in crime. I probably part of that had to do with, so I grew up in Wichita, Kansas in the 70s. Sounds really long time ago. I get that now though. But when we moved there, we moved there from Florida. And when, I was a little kid when we moved, and I probably wasn't very smart because I know my brother had to take out a map and show me where Kansas was because I had no idea. And I was like, where's the beach? He's like, there's no beach. And I'm like, we live in Fort Lauderdale. We live by the beach. And he's like, no beach. And I was like, yeah, not going. Plus I knew that Andy Gibb lived in Key West. And if I was ever going to marry Andy Gibb, he and I needed to meet. He would love me. He would wait for me to become old enough to marry him. And we were going to live happily ever. So I knew no beach, no Andy Gibb. I'm like, I'm not going to Wichita, Kansas. And my parents were like, we're going to have a nicer house. You'll have your own room. You'll go to a better school. Like, all the things. It was going to, like, they made it sound like the perfect, American ideal life. We get there and we were there maybe a month before the news announced that there was a serial killer who was killing women and in some cases children. And by that time I knew where we lived. I knew what our address was, and they put a map on the news, like with the red dots of where he had killed people. And I'm like, I think we're right here. I look at my parents like, good job, you two. Like, get me out of here. I want to go back to Florida. No, I shouldn't joke, but like growing up there, and for people who don't know this case, it's been on the news even recently. His daughter did a bunch of interviews. It's the BTK serial killer case, which stood for bind, torture, and kill. And like some parents might have turned the TV off when those 3 words are next to each other on the news, but I don't know, Jim and Pearl Burke just let their kids know everything. So I kind of grew up knowing that was going on. And if you grew up in Wichita in the 70s, it was just these things got normalized to some extent. We all had basement locks, like bolts on our basement doors, because the thinking was that he got in through the basement. So like, it took me years to not like run down to the basement, like throw the laundry in and run back up, like, because you just like were afraid of who was hiding in your basement. And then, this is back obviously when you only had landlines. Like the minute you would get home, you would check the phone line to make sure there was a dial tone, because he would cut the phone line so you couldn't call for help. Like, and those things, I think that really, I don't think it's a coincidence. I'm sorry, I'm rambling, but I want to circle back to libraries. I was really impressed with the fact that you have the Books for Babies program. I don't think it was a surprise that it was around the time we moved to Wichita. My mom was a school librarian, and every Saturday she would take me to the public library, mostly to get me out of the house so my dad could write something free for us to do. But she was also kind of making a reader out of me at the same time. But it was like after we moved to Wichita that I suddenly wanted mysteries. Like I wanted, it was Encyclopedia Brown, and then Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys, and then Mary Higgins Clark eventually. Like I just wanted all these mysteries. And when I think back on it, I think it was this idea that like in a good crime novel, things feel really dangerous and chaotic in the middle. but you kind of know that there's going to be some kind of resolution at the end. Like it might not always be a happy ending, but you at least get some kind of, the chaos gets put back together again, right? The world gets put back together again. It's like you don't go on a roller coaster for the part when you're terrified. You go for the ending, right? It's the rush when you pull into the end and it's over. And I think that those books were kind of satisfying to me in that, like, there has to be some order, right? There has to be some answers, because they didn't catch him for 30 years. So I've always been super fascinated by that. So anyway, you can tell I could talk about it all day long. I'll stop. But I don't think I would be as interested in crime as I am. I don't think I would have become a prosecutor. I don't think I would have read so many mystery novels if it weren't for growing up in that environment. Yeah.
Mhm. Mhm. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. So you mentioned Mary Higgins Clark, and you have written a book with her, I believe.
We wrote 6 books together. Yeah.
6 books.
6 books together. So she had a book called Got You Under My Skin, and she wanted to spin off a set of characters from that book where a woman named Lori Moran is a true crime producer. Like, she produces a true crime television show. And there was the potential there for a recurring series, right? And so she wanted to work with a collaborator to co-author that series with her. And then that person and she would also still be able to write their own books instead of just doing this series. So this is where the point of view switches. And I don't know how I got picked. I got a phone call saying, do you want to have lunch with Mary Higgins Clark about maybe writing a series together? And that's a very easy lunch invitation to accept. So no, I was very, I still kind of have to pinch myself that, yeah, I wrote 6 novels with Mary Higgins Clark. So, but again, could talk a whole hour about that, but I miss her very much. Yeah.
So is that series going to continue or no?
Yeah, I think it will. Yeah, I think it will. I'm actually writing with her blessing and with her family's blessing. I'm writing a sequel that we had talked about to Where Are the Children? Going way back. So it's kind of that family 40 years later. And then I think after that, the Under Suspicion series will continue with both of our names on it, of course. Yeah.
Oh, that's really interesting. Just one more question about that, and that is the process of collaboration. How do you do that?
Well, we had to figure it out because we didn't know how to do that. She had collaborated on novels before, but it was with her daughter, and they would literally sit side by side and work on it together. And apparently she didn't want me to move into her house with her. So
Go figure.
so that was off the table. But I think the way we knew it was going to work is we figured out, we both kind of just talked about our process and that we plot through character. So we decided to come up with characters first and then kind of come up with a plot that touched into all of the pressure points of those characters. If we kind of did characters first, then plot, and then we would just talk and talk and talk and talk. And I would be taking notes as fast as I could write. And instead of just doing 1 chapter and 2 chapters, we would talk through the whole book essentially, and then pass a synopsis back and forth that we would, it's kind of like, the Bible. I always joke that I can't lose this on a plane, like somebody could just write our next book if you had it. And then we would start drafting. So once we kind of had that roadmap, it was easier to pass pages back and forth. And hopefully some people who are listening have read those books, or this is probably very boring to you. By the time we had even finished the first book, I think, and then even more so after that, I don't think you can tell 2 people wrote those books. Wow. Like it is, you can pick up one of her books and one of my books and you would be able to know whose was whose, but the co-authored books, I think, have a single voice, because we worked really hard to, it's more her than me. She's the bigger name, but I don't think you would know that there were 2 hands going in to the keyboard. Yeah.
Amazing. So for both of you, you both have other jobs besides writing. And how do you manage that balance? How do you find the time to do the writing and to do your teaching or practicing of law? Erica, how does that work for you?
I don't do well balancing and juggling. So I tend to take vacation And I fully immerse myself in writing for chunks of time. My preference is weeks, but I often don't get more than a week. And if that, but I find that I need about 3 hours at least of writing to get back into the rhythm after a break, a good day of writing to start really having the word flow and the word choice come as naturally as I like it to. And then I grind. I work best when I'm writing all day with small breaks just to either clear my head and take a walk or have something to eat. But I could write, if the day didn't end, I could just keep writing. Unfortunately for me, I'm not really a night owl, and my brain tends to shut down around 9:30. So I wake up early, I work out, and I write all day. I can edit while I'm doing my day job in discrete amounts of time throughout the day, and I can squirrel away an hour here or there. I can work before work or after work, but my job doesn't really start or end at any given time. I get emails into the night and early in the morning, and to try to write anything creatively while those are coming in is next to impossible for me. But I can edit. I can sit there and I can rework a bit of what I wrote, but to write, I need a solid amount of time.
Well, thanks. Alafair, how about you?
I'm very impressed, Erica, that you can do that while you're in practice. I said I got my first idea while I was at the prosecutor's office, but I just became a person who said one day I'm going to write a book. I was not able to start it until.
Well, don't be too impressed, because after the Boys Club, I quit my job, and now I still work in a law firm, but I'm not.
Oh,
so.
Oh, okay, all right. So I couldn't write while I was a prosecutor. It's not because I was constantly at the courthouse. It's just by the time I got back, I was just mentally drained that all I wanted to do was like watch Seinfeld, eat dinner, and go to bed. But when I moved to New York to start teaching, I took a whole summer off, and I figured this is going to be the last time, like as an adult, I'm gonna have 3 months where I have no obligations. So I took golf lessons, and I finally started writing that book I've always meant to write. And then it took me another 2 years to finish it. And I'm lucky in that I have an academic position now, so I don't go home like mentally drained, and I'm not in class, 50 or 60 hours a week. And part of my job really is to sit down and write and to think about the law and to write about it. And I'm kind of lucky that the schools allowed me to, sometimes what I write about is completely made up. But, it's still about the criminal justice system, and still kind of relates to what I teach and what I write about as an academic. So it does take, I'm a bit like Erica. I write better. I know people who can just write 1 hour every day, and 2 years they finish a book. Like, I can't do that. I need big chunks of time. And like you, I kind of do best when it's just an all day situation where you don't even want to know what I look like. I may or may not make it to the shower or out of my pajamas, until it's time for dinner. But yeah, you kind of, and I do think part of the key for me, at least, is you have to just be really detached from everything else, because you're immersing yourself into a completely fictional world, and you have to stop questioning yourself and like looking outside of it. You're like, I'm going to live in this world for the next several hours. These people are real. I know what they sound like. I know what the places look like. And to me, it's at least hard to do that in fits and spurts. So I try to carve out time too.
Well, I'm impressed that that you're able to do that. That you have the discipline when you have the time to pursue that. So thank you. And do each of you have another idea bubbling for the next book? Yes, good, great.
We're both speakers, I think. Well, like I said, my next book is the sequel to Where Are the Children? And then I'm also working on my own standalone that has to do with another group of female friends where they go off on a girls' trip and bad things happen. That's okay. all I'm saying.
Erica?
My next book follows 2 female best friend ER doctors into their shift at work, and one doesn't quite make it to her next shift, and it is about uncovering the dark underbelly of what's going on at the hospital and where the friend went, and all that good juicy stuff.
Wow.
Great.
given what's happening.
I will say one thing. I think people are always impressed when they hear that someone writes and has a day job. And I've actually never spoken to someone else who does it. So I'm curious to hear what Alafair thinks, but I find it so much easier to write. I find that it helps with writer's block, because if you have it or the words aren't coming, you just have this whole other job you can do. And it's not, I would imagine there is so much pressure for just sitting alone in your house and staring at a computer screen all day. I mean, if the words aren't coming to me, I have hours and hours of other work that I can do. And I find they come when they come. And I hope that coincides with the vacation I've taken from work to write. But if it doesn't, it just, it stinks for me.
Yeah, I think there's something to be said for that. Because if you have another thing you have to do, it puts the pressure on that when you're not doing that one thing, you're like, okay, I got to write. Whereas if your one job is to write and you hit the wall, right, you might take a walk instead. And look, I get some of my best ideas while walking and things, but you might just decide to like, oh, I can take today off. It keeps you from kind of wasting too many days away if you have to structure your work, like if your writing time is to be protected instead of what you get to do every day. So I was wondering, I have taken leaves from the law school. They've been good about letting me do that. And I have to wonder, like, was I actually more productive than if I had been teaching? I'm not sure, or was I just less busy?
Yeah, honestly, it's my the one thing keeping me, in both jobs at this point. I think it's better for me.
Huh. So, Alafair, your father is a novelist, right?
Yeah, my father's James Lee Burke. Yeah,
and so were you your pattern of writing, was that inspired by him at all, or did you?
No, I kind of joked that I was there because, most people have parents who are like, no, you're not going to be a writer or an artist or a creative person. You're going to be a doctor or a lawyer. I had parents who were like, you're going to be a writer. I can tell you're going to be a writer. And I was like, no, I'm going to be a lawyer. That was my rebellion. I'm going to go to law. But so I think part of me was resistant to it because, he's extremely talented. The people who love him, like, really love him. And I do think our books are very different. I think we do both write crime novels, but he's a man of his generation from the places he grew up, and I tend to write about women of my generation and bigger cities. But I do think if you really think, like you said before, that you respected the discipline to be able to force yourself to write a book, it is an insane thing to do. Like when no one has paid you or contracted you or told you that they will buy your book, to sit down and write an entire book. Like it, I look back on it, it's like, I cannot believe I just did that. Like there was no reason I think anyone would read it, let alone buy it, let alone want a second book. And it just takes, it's kind of an audacious thing to do. And I think growing up with a writer as a parent, to me, it just seemed a normal thing to do, that if you had a story in your head, that you would actually write it down. And I think a lot of people live with stories in their head that they don't even tell people, let alone, be willing to do the work of sitting down and writing it down. So, I was always the person, even as a lawyer, I was the person who would do the bulk of the writing at the DA's office. Like to me, those muscles were just kind of normal ones to use. And I think having seen him do that, I think that's the biggest influence upon me, is like, it's totally normal to just sit there and spend hours and hours writing stuff that nobody might ever want to read, because he was unpublished for a very long time.
So Erica, what got you into writing fiction?
Not my father. My father has, it takes him forever to write an email, but he is a brilliant doctor. And I think probably that inspired my third book, having a family that is so medical. But I always fancied myself a writer, and I always thought best via the written word, far better than I did than speaking out loud. I'm sure people on this Zoom would agree. But I always, made pro-con lists and to-do lists, and everything seemed to make sense when I wrote it down. And so I think maybe that is why I took the legal path, because it was the most writing and that didn't bother me. But I reached this point where I liked being a lawyer, but I didn't love it. And I loved to write. So I did what was insane. And I took time and wrote a novel. You have to write the whole thing, or I did at least, the first time around. And it was a wonderful experience. And I think, given my parents' encouragement that I have a profession, much as Alafair was saying, that I be a doctor or a lawyer, they are not kids of, the Great Depression, but they sort of act like everything is going to disappear at any minute. And if you have a profession, you'll be okay because someone will need your training. But for people with that mentality, and I don't think they were wrong, by the way, I only could write my first book because I was a lawyer, but for people with that mentality, they were unbelievably supportive when I said I wanted to write. And I think it's a very fragile place to embark on, as Alafair was saying, something that's so crazy and seems like such a pipe dream, which is such a pipe dream for so many people. I wonder if I had had anyone say, the chances are 1 in a million, and stop wasting your vacation time and start lounging on a beach and vacate your life, whether I would have been fragile enough in that moment to do it. But I didn't have any of that. I had an unbelievable support network who encouraged me every step of the way. And they gave me this new career.
Well, that's wonderful. Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
One last question for each of you. What's on your bedside table to read next?
Literally on my bedside table is black cake. No, it's a book. And I've just cracked it, and I think it's brilliant. I think it is Charmaine Mulkerson's debut novel, and her prose is really, really delicious. And I think she's got a long career ahead of her, and I'm excited to finish it.
Great, good. Alafair?
Well, I'm reading an advanced copy of I'll Be You, called by Janelle Brown. If anybody has read her work, she's author of Pretty Little Things and several other novels. But since that's not out yet, I'll cheat and say it's a book that I love that's out. Oh, one of my favorite books just came out. It's new books by Alex Segura, called Secret Identity. And it's very unique and creative. It's set in the world of like New York City, 1970s comic book.
Oh,
yeah, I heard that was great.
Yeah. Gotten all kinds of starred reviews, and it's very it's good. And that just came out. So Alex Segura.
that's great. Good. Well, thank you so much. We are so grateful for the gift of your time and the gift of your talent, not just for us, but for the larger world. Thank you. And
Thank you.
And I personally really enjoyed both of your books, and I encourage our listeners tonight and watchers to check them both out, and they can be found at Elm Street Books. And I understand that they even have some autographed copies of some of your books. So that's good. That's great. And we also want to invite folks to our next Friends author event, which is on next Thursday night, May 3rd. And
March 3rd.
March 3rd. Thank you. Yes. Oh gosh.
I
Yes.
got
Rushing ahead to spring. March 3rd. And that will be with Bobby Valentine, one of our Stanford's native boys, and his co-author, Peter Golenbach. And they will be speaking about Bobby's book, reflecting on his career primarily in baseball. So we hope that people will join us for that. And for more information on that author event, you can check it the fergusonlibrary.org website. So again, our thanks to both of you, and we wish you all the best for your future writing. Thank you, and good night to everyone.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Alice.